Okay, so what I'm going to do now is get back into our hard effects. I'm going to bring the weight up just a bit, maybe to about 14. And I'm going to come to the CrapsTable, collision, and I'm going to bring the bounce down a little bit, maybe to 85. At this point, when everything's getting so close to being right on, and I'm going to hit recalculate. When everything's getting so close to being right on, your adjustments actually can be very severe if you make too much of them. So make your adjustments just kind of minor at this point. Yeah, you don't want to quite double things. And at this point, we could probably turn the torque down a little bit because it's kind of just flying by itself at this point. And it didn't quite have that much force. And we want it to hit that backside. Let me pull back like this. Yeah, if you see here, look, it's gonna go right off the edge. So I can just increase or decrease my settings here. Maybe a little less bounce. I'm going to leave that. I'm going to go back here to the actual hard effects. And I don't want to increase the weight just yet. Let's go back in here to rotation. And let's bring the minimum torque to 50 and the maximum to 80. Just turn that down just a little bit. And this pretty much at this point is how these dynamics work for things like this. They're not the most intuitive tools, but for something like this, I think it's actually perfect. Still not, not always the easiest. You could just be nice just to set up a preset that says, CrapsTable dice. And actually, you know what? I got to go the other way with my. I think I went the wrong way with the minimum. Let's bring the minimum torque back. Let's bring this back to 100. And we'll bring this down to about 20. We'll see how that works for us. Give it a little calculation. This is the worst part about it. This is about as hard as waiting for it to render. But it's got a nice little hit there, spin, and probably about the same distance on the other side of the tables where it should come down and hit again. And don't forget too that part of the reason this has so much force is because over 10 frames we're making it hit the table and it's bouncing back up. Okay, so the spin is good, but we're still going a little bit too far. So I think at this point what I'll do is I'll come back to the CrapsTable now, and let's bring down the bounce, the force of that collision. The only problem with that is that if you do it too much, I've actually noticed that the collisions go right through. There's not enough force there, and the die itself might just jump right through the table. But by bringing that bounding and binding force down, the bounce and bind force, it's not quite. Think of the collision as not quite as elastic. There, it's not quite going up as much. And so for the last thing, just to get it down just a little bit more, we'll come back to the die, and we'll bring down the weight. So I'll bring it to maybe 20. And I think that's where I had it in my tests. We'll do one more calculation. I just give the die a little bit more weight. So it's kind of a combination of all these different factors. When it comes to the cloth, there's actually some nice presets to work with. With this kind of thing, there's not. Okay, now it's still kind of floating. It's floating away, doing its own thing. So what I'm going to do now is work on my initial keyframe here. And the reason I'm going to do this is because this is what's creating it, making it just bounce a little too much. So I'm actually going to delete this keyframe. And what I'm going to do is probably turn the, I just click the hard effects off. Still at frame 0, but maybe about 20, 25. I know it should come down a little bit sooner than that. But at 25, I'm just going to bring it down. And as I do this, I'm not going to rotate it as much. We'll give it just one little rotation. If you rotate it a little too crazy, you kind of get that effect we were doing. So just one little rotation like that. Let's make sure it's actually hitting the table, which it is, and that's at frame 23, and I have my calculate button off the side of the screen. It told me no dynamics. That means I actually have to turn my, got to remember to turn that back on, and I'll hit the calculate button. Okay, so basically not as much impact here because it's happening over less time. See, now we have a much nicer roll rather than a bounce that's flying across the table. And a nice tumble. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that so we can set up our other die. Let that finish. Almost ready. And then we'll just zoom out. You can take a look. Because it's already calculated, so you can change the view. It's not like a preview render or anything. You hit the play button. Very nice. And I need a little bit more time on the scene itself. It'll hit that back wall and bounce back, but I think that looks really good. So I'm going to press S, save the scene. Let's make this about 200 frames. We'll recalculate in a minute, but I need to calculate it longer than 60 frames so it can actually hit that back wall and bounce. But for now, let's do this. Remember, the scene is saved. Save that scene often. I hate to say this, but these dynamics can really crash your system sometimes. What really helps, though, is a lot less geometry calculating by turning down that subdivision, which we did. All right, so we got that die. Control-C. Let's clone it. Okay? Now we have two of them. Take the second clone. Don't move the keyframes. You can, but what I'm going to do instead is go and move path. I'm going to move the path over. Why recreate the keyframes? Okay? And at frame 0, I'm just going to rotate it like this. Just something different. Shift forward arrow, and I'll hit my center button here. And then this keyframe, 23. Maybe I'll hit create key at 24. And then delete the key at 23, just to give it a variation. And we'll just twist it, maybe this way. Okay. S to save the scene. I'm going to hit my calculate button. It's off the screen here, but it's just in my object properties tab. And just having those initial two keyframes different, you'll see that when it hits, the dynamics are going to calculate them differently. And then we have a nice roll all the way through. Now, I might need to go back now because I had changed these keyframes and changed just a couple of things. One of them being that they don't collide with each other, or if they hit each other, they'll actually bounce. The other thing being the weight. Notice that when they come down, they actually just roll. Okay, because I had changed my bounce and my weight for these die based on my initial fast keyframe. Now that I have a little bit slower keyframe, a little bit longer, there's not as much impact. So I'm going to just bring the weight down to about 15. And you don't have to make them both the same. It actually could be good for each die to be maybe a little bit different. Okay. And then when you go to the collision for these now, for the die, exclusive collision for the CrapsTable. Okay. You can tell it to be with the others as well, or interaction as with other boxes, but I think it's okay with the CrapsTable because you just got to make sure that this keyframe for this next die, if you want, either one, just make sure that this first keyframe is just separated just a little bit, okay, and they won't run into each other. I find that's a little bit easier than trying to have it calculate for both. So this is a calculation with a little less weight and a little bit different keyframe. You know, we can come back and put the bounce back up, and or what really works well by each of these which I kind of like doing, is going to back up to this torque and maybe going like 150. I'll just do it on one of them and watch what happens. It's kind of fun to play with. And those of you with brand new 8-core machines and 64-bit machines, you're going to get a lot better speed than I'm doing here on the calculations on my lowly little G5. Okay. And what will happen here is that that'll start speeding up with the torque, which is kind of neat. And then we'll do one more calculation and we'll set up our camera. I'm going to bring my bounce to maybe 85 for the table. So there's a little bit stronger collision. Oops. Click back in here and hit S to save. And I'm going to do one more calculation. And the other thing you got to remember too is that you will probably never repeat the same exact moves and results. All the results are always going to be different. So you can see they're coming up just a little bit higher with that extra bounce. Just the one die is. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to set up my little camera move here based on this calculation. What that means is I need to actually make sure that it's calculated all the way through. Oh, and on a side note, the last thing I did after I'd finished making the stencils for the CrapsTable is I just put a little logo in there. If you got your own logo or a photo or something, I just made a flat, rounded box and did an image map on there in the surface editor. Where's my logo? Right there. And just put a flat image map on there. Okay. So we're going to set up the camera moves in the next one, and then we'll put some surfaces on and some lights, and we're good to go.